Next on Currents News, an in-depth half an hour dedicated to the fight against religious persecution around the globe. Political and religious leaders are saying the 21st century is seeing the largest scale of anti-religious persecution since the end of the Cold War. We will look back at Currents News' past coverage of this worldwide crisis ahead of next week's global summit in D.C. to protect religious freedom, and what's being done to help those who are being persecuted for their faith. A special Currents News starts right now. Good evening, I'm Tamara Lane. Leaders from around the world will gather in Washington, D.C. next week for the second ministerial to advance religious freedoms. The event, which starts on July 16th, aims to promote and protect religious rights and freedoms, especially for persecuted minorities. As we look back at Currents News special coverage that examines religious persecution around the world, we begin in Iraq, where top Catholic leaders have a stark outlook in the battle to save Christians. Currents News' Michelle Powers first reported on this important story back in May.
Bombing after bombing around the world. Just the most recent pattern of attacks against modern-day Christians, making 2019 the bloodiest year yet for believers.
Religious persecution knows no boundaries. It respects no faith. It attacks everyone. So unfortunately, we're seeing a rising tide of persecution around the world.
Officials around the world agree the persecution of Christians is nearing genocide. Knox Thames is a U.S. Special Advisor for Religious Minorities. He says religious freedom is one of the most violated liberties in the world, especially in Iraq. In the birthplace of Christianity, the faith is facing extinction. Since the U.S.-led invasion toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, the Christian community there has dwindled from 1.5 million to less than 120,000. Despite the fact that the Islamic State terror group has been defeated in the country, the Archbishop of Erbil, Bashar Warda, believes there is still a fear stopping Christians from coming home. Fear the Islamic State will return and attack again. He says, quote, one of the oldest churches, if not the oldest church in the world, is perilously close to extinction. Those of us who remain must be ready to face martyrdom. Pascal Warda, a Christian and former minister in the country, echoes his concerns. There are still members of the Islamic State in hiding.
The spirit that exists already is there. Any Muslim who will not see his neighbor like his brother, like citizens, like partnership in the same land and the same rights, he can do this in any time.
Archbishop Warda accuses the world's leaders of political correctness, saying many will not speak out for Christians in fear of being labeled Islamophobic. Michelle Powers, Currents News.
The Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka this past April were just one of the latest attacks on people because of their faith. While the world was still struggling to understand the tragedy that killed over 200 people, Tablet's editor emeritus Ed Wilkinson spoke to Crux's editor-in-chief John Allen for an in-depth analysis on modern Christian persecution.
John, how ironic that only a few months ago in January we had to break into our coverage of Pope Francis in Panama for World Youth Day to report on the breaking news of the bombing of a Catholic cathedral in the Philippines. We spoke with you, but now it seems like this modern-day persecution of Christians is getting worse. What's your read on it?
Inarguably, the persecution of Christians is bad and getting worse. And statistically speaking, Christians are the most persecuted religious community on the planet, in part because Christianity is the largest religion on the planet, about 2.3 billion people. 2/3 of whom today live in the developing world. They live outside the West. They're often in some pretty rough neighborhoods. In many cases, they're living as minorities. Open Watch International estimates about 200 million Christians around the world live every day with the real danger of physical assault, arrest, persecution, torture, imprisonment, in some cases, as we saw last Sunday, even death. It is simply a reality of our time. And the uglier and even sadder reality is that often these incidents do fall on the holiest days of the Christian calendar, particularly Christmas and Easter, because those are days when churches are especially full, and from the point of view of warped terrorist logic, they are especially ripe targets.
You know, the experts claim that as many as 100,000 Christian martyrs die every year for the faith. Now, you know, when I was young, they told us we probably would never have to die for our faith. But how do we begin to get this, get a hold on this thing?
One of the problems in terms of trying to tell the story of anti-Christian persecution around the world is that here in the developed West, in the United States, for instance, there are limits on religious freedom, worrying limits that we have to deal with, but we don't experience anything like the kind of threats to life and limb that Christians in other parts of the world do. I mean, I grew up in rural Western Kansas in the 70s and 80s. My idea of suffering for the faith was eating fish sticks and mac and cheese on Fridays during Lent. I mean, that's as close as I ever got to carrying the cross. But the reality of today's world is much different. Anti-Christian persecution is the greatest human rights scourge of our time. It's also the least told story of our time. The problem is much bigger and more complicated than that. What has to happen is that we've got to break that wall of silence. From a Catholic point of view, what needs to happen is that from the Pope on down, in the pulpits on Sundays, which is still the primary gathering place for Catholics all around the world, there has to be consistent messaging around this issue.
John, thanks for your insights this afternoon. Unfortunately, it's a topic that we probably will be returning to. But thank you very much for today.
Anytime. Glad to be with you.
As that interview highlights, the problem is widespread. And as the American Church addresses ways to protect religious freedom, the Vatican joined forces with the United States to ensure faith may be freely worshipped. That effort has been underway since April. Melissa Butts had this update ahead of Religious Freedom Week.
As U.S. bishops are getting ready to celebrate Religious Freedom Week, the Vatican also prays and acts to protect what they call a fundamental human right. Cardinal Parolin regrets that religious freedom continues to be threatened and that therefore the situation for many believers is far from improving.
A brief consideration of the numerous violations of religious liberty on the global stage and the appalling number of innocent persons that suffer persecutions because of their beliefs, including many Christians, should leave no doubts in our minds that we are dealing with an aggressive attack that strikes at the very core of the enjoyment of fundamental human rights.
He expressed this in an event organized by the Stand Together Project and the United States Embassy to the Holy See. It was an occasion in which the Vatican Secretary of State also recalled the violation of religious freedom threatens the common good.
Despite so many efforts to promote and reinforce the fundamental human right of religious freedom, we are actually witnessing a continued deterioration, we might say even an assault of this inalienable right in many parts of the world.
The host of the meeting was the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Callista Gingrich. She insisted that protecting this freedom is urgent, and it is work requiring everyone's help.
Our symposium today comes at an urgent time. Unfortunately, for millions around the world, religious freedom is currently under threat or restricted entirely. All of us across governments, civil society, faith organizations, and media must work together to advance and defend this cause.
This drama affects more than 60% of the world's population, who reside in countries where there's not complete religious freedom, as explained during the event. Whether in Rome or in the United States, the North American Church is continuing to take a stand for religious liberty, ensuring that everyone has the freedom to worship, whether here or abroad. At the Vatican, Melissa Butts, Currents News.
There's a lot more news headed your way. A look at a new commission created by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on unalienable rights and the role of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. Then attacks on churches throughout Syria, how Christians have been targeted by the so-called Islamic State. And more than 70 years after their persecution, the Pope celebrates the beatification of 7 martyrs. Do you have a story idea or want to share a tip? Email us at newstips@desalesmedia.org or call our 24-hour number 718-517-3122. We'll be right back.
As human rights claims have proliferated, some claims have come into tension with one another, provoking questions and clashes about which rights are entitled to gain respect. Nation-states and international institutions remain confused about their respective responsibilities concerning human rights.
That was U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on his decision to open a commission on unalienable rights earlier this week, which will review the role of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. Critics are afraid this could be the Trump administration's way of pulling back on protections for minority groups. As we continue on this special edition of Currents News, Emily Druby sat down with national correspondent for the Tablet and Crux, Christopher White, on Tuesday to discuss the implications this could have on Christians.
Christopher, what will this commission actually do?
Well, the Secretary of State said that he's going to commission this group to look at fundamental questions about what it means to be human. What are human rights? What does the Declaration itself sort of enshrine as these rights that are sort of, unalienable, as the commission says, and then take these fundamental questions and, apply them to policy situations. Now, it remains very unclear. It's a group of 10 commissioners, and they have a heavy lift.
News of this commission comes at a time when the faith in the public square is increasingly under scrutiny. Just last night, a California bill that would have required priests to violate the seal of the confessional died in committee. Christopher, why was this bill killed? And what can you tell us about the efforts of the faith community to oppose it?
So this bill was killed because the assemblyman that was pushing this forward realized he just didn't have the votes to go forward. It was quite controversial because the faith community has been saying it's a fundamental violation of religious freedom to force a priest to reveal what has been told to him in the confessional. And in fact, today they were scheduled to have a rally of several hundred Catholics that were going to go to the state legislature and protest this. They don't have to go now because this bill has sort of died.
That's so interesting. National correspondent for the Tablet and Crux, Christopher White, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Emily.
A desecrated tabernacle and decapitated image of Christ. Stark reminders of the oppression Syrian Christians face as the conflict with the so-called Islamic State devastated areas of the country. Melissa Butts has the disturbing details.
They shot at least 6 times to try to destroy the body of Christ. It's the door of a tabernacle of a parish in the Syrian city of Qasab. The Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and other jihadist groups occupied the city for months. This cross shattered by ISIS belongs to a parish in Batnaya, Iraq. In another church, terrorists shot this statue of the Blessed Mother. This other decapitated Christ was not spared from the desecration perpetrated by the jihadists. They had a clear objective: to eliminate the Christian presence from Iraq and Syria, their people, their liturgical objects, and their roots. These remains, which testify to ethnic cleansing, have been exhibited very close to the Vatican. The Hungarian government has compiled them in this exhibition, which after visiting Budapest, New York, and Washington, has arrived in Rome.
There are people near us who sometimes have to give their own lives or suffer daily discrimination because of their faith in Jesus Christ. It is good that these objects, photos, and their voices come to us. It is great that they arrive in Rome, especially now when we are talking about young people, so that we realize how important our faith is and how much we owe it.
When they didn't use bullets, they used fire to destroy prayer books and Bibles. In some churches, they left no trace. Many of the ones they left standing were used as a firing range. In addition to Syria and Iraq, extremism has also spread to Egypt. These are the faces and stories of the 21 Coptic Christians beheaded by ISIS on a Libyan beach. The crime was for being Christians, Nazarenes. Therefore, ISIS marked the houses of the infidels with this letter, N in Arabic. As soon as it self-proclaimed its state of terror, ISIS sent this letter to the Christians with an ultimatum: convert, die, or pay the jizya, a tax for non-Muslims. Even the jihadists minted their own coin, these gold dinars. The map of the Middle East is full of wounds. Many Christians have been killed who refuse to leave their homeland or deny their faith. Father Rahid Ghani did not close the doors of his church. This Iraqi priest was assassinated by extremists in Mosul in 2007 after Sunday Mass. In 2014, his tomb, located in Karam Lesh, was desecrated in this way by the ISIS militia. In Rome, Melissa Butts, Currents News.
Back at home, religious leaders and homeland security experts have gone on the offensive against the growing dangers that are facing churches and worshipers. Currents News' Tim Harfman reported in June on the best solutions and the worst threats.
An all too familiar scene for modern-day worshipers. Attack after attack around the world at the hands of terrorists. 2019 is the bloodiest year yet for believers.
This is the world we live in, folks.
At Pace University, religious leaders and law enforcement officials are tackling the issue head-on, discussing recent attacks and ways of preventing future terror. William Sweeney is the assistant director for the FBI's New York office.
People should understand that everybody has safety as a priority, but to maintain awareness of your surroundings, just like you would if you were walking on any street in any county, any state, any city.
He says having cameras and alarms isn't enough. Houses of worship need protocols in place to prevent attacks.
Do you know what your exit plan is? Do you know what the exits look like? Do you know what the inside of the building looks like? Have ushers talked with each other about a plan? Have ushers talked with the pastors, the monsignors, the priests?
For Alan Hausman, acts of terror hit home. He worships at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. It was October 27, 2018, when a gunman opened fire, killing 11 innocent people.
It was almost unbelievable to even think that in our small little synagogue this could happen.
They're watching in disbelief as mass shootings and bombings continue around the world.
When the other attacks we read about occur, it's almost like it takes people right back to that day.
For Alan, the Pittsburgh shooting has taken a toll on him personally.
I have good days and bad days, good hours and bad hours. Be honest with you, I still don't sleep well most evenings. My mind's still running a million miles an hour.
But he has faith and is helping the Tree of Life Synagogue to have a plan in place.
One of our members that was killed was our greeter usher, and so it's my personal commitment to take his place and be there at the door to greet everybody.
Mr. Sweeney says worshipers shouldn't be afraid either, but they must be prepared.
Be aware of your surroundings and have a plan.
In Lower Manhattan, Tim Harfman, Currents News.
Still to come on this special edition of Currents News. They were tortured, humiliated, and imprisoned for their faith. 7 bishops who died fighting a communist regime that wanted them to lose their religion are honored by the Pope. And the tablet has a brand new page called Our Diocesan Family, where you can share your pictures of recent baptisms, Holy Communions, confirmations, marriage, all the joyous sacraments. For more details and to submit your photo, go to thetablet.org/ourdiocesanfamily. Your picture may be published in an upcoming issue of the newspaper. We'll be right back. Welcome back to this special edition of Currents News as we continue to highlight the plight of Christians fighting persecution around the globe. Over a month ago, the Holy Father went on a trip to Romania, and while he was there, he beatified 7 bishops who died while fighting the communist regime in the country. Melissa Butts has that story.
On May 15, 1948, in the Field of Freedom in Blaj, Transylvania, the communist regime began heinous religious persecution. On that day, the authorities asked Greek Catholics to abandon their faith and join the Orthodox Church to separate them from Rome. The majority refused. Thus began one of the darkest eras in the history of the Roman Catholic Church in Romania. The government confiscated their property, imprisoned their bishops, and arrested many priests. More than 70 years later, in the same place, Pope Francis celebrated the beatification of 7 bishops martyred in those days, between 1950 and 1970. They were imprisoned and subjected to torture and humiliation. This official formula pronounced by the Pope made these 7 bishops blessed in the eyes of the Church by their martyrdom.
Beatorum nomine impostum appellerum, atque dia secunda mensi Iuni, in locis et modis iuris statutis, quotanis celebrari possent, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
In his homily, the Pope recalled the painful times in which ideology was put before people's right to life.
I 9 beati hanno sofferto e sacrificato la loro vita, opponendosi a un sistema ideologico illiberale e coercitivo di diritti fondamentali della persona umana. In quel triste periodo, la vita della comunità cattolica era messa a dura prova dal regime dittatoriale e ateo.
The Pope wanted to highlight above all the example of these martyrs. They did not die hating their persecutors, but rather showing great mercy toward them.
È eloquente quanto ha dichiarato durante la prigionia il vescovo Iuliu Hosu. Dio ci ha mandato in queste tenebre della sofferenza per donare il perdono e pregare per la conversione di tutti. Queste parole sono il simbolo e la sintesi dell'atteggiamento con il quale questi beati nel periodo della prova hanno sostenuto il loro popolo nel continuare a confessare la fede senza cedimenti e senza ritorsioni.
Pope Francis also warned of the danger of new ideologies of our days that seek to colonize culture and society.
Colonizzazioni ideologiche che disprezzano il valore della persona, della vita, del matrimonio e della famiglia e nuociono con proposte alienanti ugualmente atee come nel passato, in modo particolare ai nostri giovani e bambini, lasciandoli privi di radici da cui crescere. E allora tutto diventa irrilevante se non serve ai propri interessi immediati e induce le persone ad approfittare dalle altre e a trattarsi come meri oggetti.
Therefore, the Pope encouraged the fight against these new ideologies so they don't invade society. He invited fraternity and dialogue before any kind of division. Before leaving, Pope Francis led the recitation of the Regina Caeli and imparted a blessing on the more than 70,000 pilgrims who participated in this beatification ceremony. Melissa Butts, Currents News.
That is our special edition of Currents News. I'm Tamara Lane. Thank you for joining us because we are putting your faith in the news. Hope to see you again next time.